Lord, you're here.
That's why I came.
Yeah, exactly. Right. This is Matt Tocheri. He is right now at Lakehead University in Canada. He was a grad student at the same time I was. We graduated within a few months of each other. He was the grad student.
I graduated.
Yeah,
There it is. That's important.
Within a few months of each other. He was the grad student that was like the annoying one when we were all students, because sooner or later, if you were a grad student during that time period, the professor would say, "Why can't you be more like Matt Tocheri?" And so that happened all the time. And he did a lot of really amazing work as a grad student, including getting a science paper published, which is super irritating when you have to measure up to that, which we did not. He also has a very interesting past. He was a former billiards champion and an erstwhile pool hustler. He was also a piano player who taught himself to play the piano and then later played for B.B. King, toured with them. So he's just one of these people that does all these different things.
I played in a band that opened.
No, you and I hate.
Anyway, so this is Matt Tocheri, and he's going to say about Flores, where he is currently the director. So he sort of bounces from success to success to success. You're going to tell us all about it, right, man?
Do my best.
Talk better be good. So,
Think you can, if you want, just click on it, push it off to the side, but it's the only way that they can also see
Yeah,
your
right.
PowerPoint. Just drag it, yeah,
Oh, I see.
and X out that top one.
all right.
Now we should be good. Promise.
Well, thanks, Brian. Don't believe anything he said. It's not anything like what he said. I wish I had that kind of. Anyway, I am very fortunate in that somehow I found myself to do research on Homo floresiensis, and so I haven't given a talk for a few years because of the pandemic. So although I've given them, but I'm used to sitting behind my laptop in the office, probably with no pants, something like that. But anyway, now I'm here. And so let's see how this goes. But I'm going to try and talk a little bit about past, present, and maybe future directions for research surrounding Homo floresiensis. And so for those of you that are familiar with this topic, there'll be some stuff for you. But for those of you that aren't that familiar, you'll be able to follow. Okay, so.
The clicker, the bottom button, that's not working? Maybe the
Can I use the arrow keys or no?
I'm gonna be PhD.
down would be.
There we go.
Oh,
Dan was like everywhere. And he's there. I was gonna say USB. No, I know.
no, it's not in the laptop.
Like, I completely forgot they were feeding us even, so I was like, okay. I usually pump around this time, so that's why I was like, oh.
Just try the clicker once. It works.
It worked before. But this one.
Before that up.
The Wally chair. All right.
Okay, so 18 years ago, on the 28th of October, this discovery was first announced. And it literally sent shockwaves through the paleoanthropological community, as well as the general science community and the general public. It was a completely unexpected extinct human species that was named Homo floresiensis. And this new species was proposed based on the skeletal and dental features of these remains that were recovered on the Indonesian island of Flores. Very quickly became known as the Hobbits of human evolution. And this quote says, suddenly became by no wish of their own, both important and renowned, and troubled councils of the wise and the great. And of course, the wise and the great mean like people like Brian. And my friends still tease me relentlessly about this because first time that I read the papers, which was the day after, I think on October 29th, I was at a conference in Canada. And someone came down, a friend of mine, and they handed me this paper, and I read through it very quickly, and I stood up and I exclaimed, wow, what a wonderful time to be alive. And the reason why I felt that was, it was just something so exciting, because at the time, I was still a graduate student, and this was something completely out of the textbooks. We were not expecting anything like this, and it was just thrilling to be around when all of a sudden a discovery was happening in real time, as opposed to reading what happened 50 years ago. Now, arguably, the most shocking aspect of the discovery was the small brain, as well as the small body size of the holotype of the species, which is known as LB1, the Angua1. And this anatomy, in combination with the relatively recent age, which suggested that it overlapped temporally in time with our own species, Homo sapiens. And initially it was said that these remains of the holotype were 18,000 years old. Now, not only this, but you throw in this recent age and very unexpected anatomy, but then you throw in suggestions that these hobbits were making sophisticated stone artifacts in order to hunt and butcher bison-sized elephants, and even cooked them over open fires. And it is not hard to understand why immediately after these two papers appeared in Nature, that all hell broke loose, essentially. Now, for me at the time, I remember returning to ASU, and right after that time, it was clear that the professors were a little confused. Everyone was talking about it. Some professors were more sure of themselves than others, but many of them seemed very insecure. Like, what is this? Is this real? And for us as graduate students, I think that was really interesting, right? Because instead of now them being able to tell us with this authoritative voice about what was going on, they weren't really sure. And so it was kind of up to all of us individually to try and figure it out. Now, for the next several years, there were many intense debates over whether these peculiar skeletal remains really represented a long-lost evolutionary relative of modern humans, or did they instead represent modern humans after all, but just albeit with some sort of pathology or growth or developmental defect. And at the time, it felt like every person you talked to had a very strong opinion of it. You would go to the meetings and there were literally, people screaming at each other about it. Everyone was talking about it in every single water cooler, no matter what their specialty was. It was just something about it really captivated everyone. And I think it's really this combination of all of these things. Like if you think about Homo naledi, for instance, another spectacular discovery, but no stone artifacts. Age, initially they didn't have any ages for it. So there were, in some ways, it was really just the anatomy that everyone was talking about a couple of years after the discovery. Whereas with Homo floresiensis, from the get-go, it was all of these things combined. Didn't matter if you were an archaeologist or an anatomist or someone that looked at the evolution of behavior, everyone had something to say. Now, over the next several years, this intense debate raged on, but eventually, at least in my opinion, it began to settle. There are still some debaters out there in terms of people that still think that this is not a real other species. But generally, you open a textbook now or sit in an undergraduate class anywhere in the world, and more often than not, you're hearing that this is seen as a legitimate other species, just one that overlapped with us. And so as the dust began to settle, we see that from head to toe, Homo floresiensis displays a combination of anatomy that is different from any other species that we know. It has a combination of ancient as well as derived human features that distinguishes it from us as well as all other extinct human species. And most interestingly, I find that it displays anatomy was otherwise thought to have gone extinct between 2 and 3 million years ago. And so take that type of anatomy. If you were to just find this in East Africa, in sediments like where Brian works, there would be no debate about it. It would be like, hey, that's kind of like what we're expecting or what we would expect to find. But here we're talking about finding it on an isolated island in Indonesia within recent times or relatively recent times, overlapping in time with us. And so it's extraordinary. From the neck down, it really strongly resembles Australopiths, in particular, like the skeleton of Lucy 3 million years ago in East Africa. But in other important ways, particularly in its face, teeth, and jaws, it looks like other members of the genus Homo. And its whole skeleton shows that unquestionably it was adapted to walking on 2 legs like us. But their legs were proportionally short and their feet were proportionally long. But I mean, they're hobbits, right? So we should have expected that. And together, this indicates that they were likely better climbers and probably less efficient runners than we are, but otherwise bipeds. Now, to give you a bit more detail about this, for example, the proportions between different parts of the body help us determine this. And as an example, within humans and great apes, we know that these proportions between our upper limb, and in this case, in red, the humerus, and the lower limb, showing the femur, the difference in these proportions are strongly correlated with the various locomotor repertoires we see in these living animals. And so for orangutans, for instance, they have very long arms, long humeri compared to their femur, and they're 95%, they spend 95% of their time arboring, climbing, and moving around. Whereas if you look at us, well, you know, our humerus is really short compared to our femur. We have this elongated hind limb that reflects our behavioral specialization of being bipeds. Now, when we look at the body proportions of extinct human species like Homo floresiensis here, or Australopithecus afarensis, we can try to reconstruct, well, how were they moving around? And in both Homo floresiensis and Lucy, you can see that their femur is longer than their humerus, but not by very much. And so it's distinctly different from what we see in us. And this similarity between these two species, I think, suggests that they shared a similar locomotor repertoire that likely included walking on the ground on 2 legs, but also probably involved a significant amount of climbing. This is also seen further looking at the proportions of the inner proportions of the hind limb. So if we look at the proportions of the foot compared to the femur, you can see that orangutans have very, very long feet, and we have very, very short feet. Chimps and gorillas fall in between these two extremes. Now, here, having these shorter feet are really important for us for not only walking bipedally, but in particular for running. So walking bipedally, we can have proportionally longer feet potentially, and it wouldn't really impact our energetic performance. However, when you start picking up speed, this becomes a problem, both for clearing the foot after you're taking off, as well as the pressures that are exerted on the forefoot. And so as bipeds with a foot about half the length of our femur, we're well adapted to both walking and running on the ground. But as a biped with feet about 67% the length of the femur, Homo floresiensis was well adapted to both climbing, walking and climbing, but not running. I think this is the big difference between these. And unfortunately, with species like Luce or Australopithecus afarensis, we still don't have a really good idea of their full foot proportions. There hasn't been a skeleton complete enough to give us these ideas. And in some cases, I think we may be overplaying in our minds how derived their foot morphology may or may not be. So this is where we still need a lot of fossil evidence to help flesh out this story. But nonetheless, what does this mean? How can we put all this into a broader perspective? Well, for one, encoded deep within our DNA, all of us living today, and all of us have almost identical DNA. This helps us reconstruct the story of how we as a species originated in Africa somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 years ago, and how all of us are the direct descendants of ancient African populations, some of which happened to disperse out of Africa more recently, generally probably between about 50 and 70,000 years ago. And this has led to our species rapidly dispersing throughout the earth. But it's not the first time that this pattern has occurred during human evolution. And to me, that is one of the most interesting aspects. This is something that seems to repeat as we go back in time. For instance, the complete genomes, which we are incredibly privileged to have. Like I think back to when I started graduate school and this was a dream, like we were talking about, that's going to happen like after our careers are done. And yet here we are, we have the complete Neanderthal genome and now even the complete Denisovan genome. We had no idea Denisovans were even around and we still basically know them only from genetic evidence. But these genomes show that their DNA is 99.7% identical to us genetically. We also know that Neanderthals had large brains and they had limb proportions like us. And almost certainly Denisovans did too. But we're waiting on the fossil evidence to confirm it. So the three of us as species share common ancestry, right? And obviously there's been an age-old debate about whether or not should we consider them a different species or not. Whatever side you fall on in those debates, we share common ancestry that goes well beyond the last common ancestor that all of us share. And this ancestry traces back to Africa roughly 800,000 years ago. But a small part of that ancestral African population dispersed into Eurasia, after which connections with the African populations were soon lost. Those that survived in East and South Asia evolved into Denisovans. Those in Europe and Western Asia into Neanderthals. Those that remained in Africa evolved to us. And yet again, this is not the first time something like this had occurred. Sometime between 1.5 and 2, or maybe even 3 million years ago, an even earlier hominin dispersal in Africa occurred that included the ancestors of Homo floresiensis. Long before the shared common ancestor of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans had even evolved. So the elephant in the room, of course, is where does Homo floresiensis trace its ancestry more specifically? In other words, is this taxon island dwarf descendant of Asian Homo erectus, or possibly early Homo? Or alternatively, does it trace its ancestry within an as yet unknown hominin lineage, again, possibly early Homo? in Asia with a small brain and small body. Now, interestingly, most people do not realize that both of these scenarios were proposed by Brown et al. In 2004 in the first Nature papers that were written about and describing Homo floresiensis. But for whatever reason, the first hypothesis here struck a chord with scientists and the general public alike, and it has become the main narrative you'll hear when people talk or discuss where did Homo floresiensis come from. Now, I do not think there's enough evidence to reject either of these scenarios. But if I was cornered by someone, someone tough like Dr. Vilmore here, who as a teenager, I don't know if you know, but he was employed to serve warrants on the back streets of Baltimore. And I would definitely say the evidence actually favors alternative hypothesis here, number 2. Now, before I get to explaining exactly why I think this is likely the case, I want to clear a few other things up about what we know, or what we think we know about floresiensis. Now, we've learned a great deal more about this enigmatic hominin species over the past 18 years. Not everything has turned out to be as spectacular as was initially or originally thought. At the time of the discovery, as I mentioned earlier, Homo floresiensis remains were dated to as recent as 18 or up to 13,000 years ago, using charcoal samples recovered where you see these green stars. Now, these are in relation to where LB1 was found, which was way further back in the southern corner of the square. So you can see there's a displacement between where the actual coordinates of the charcoals are relative to where the skeleton came from. Now, however, as excavations have continued at the site, it became clear over several years that the stratigraphy, that is the way that all of these different layers of sediment are related to one another, was more complicated than was originally thought based off this single sector where the skeleton was found. And it became clear that all of these sediments here are much younger sediments that are unconformably overlying this older pedestal of deposits. And this is particularly important because this at the top of the pedestal here, we actually have a radiocarbon date from charcoal that is 46,000 years old. So I remember learning in undergraduate anthropology, how can you have older dates, younger dates below? Well, you've got some sort of unconformable sequence. And basically, this data, along with other dating evidence that we compiled, essentially shows that this pedestal, including all of the remains attributed to Homo floresiensis, are all older than at least 46,000 years ago, but all the skeletal remains are likely between at least 60,000 and 100,000 years old. The stone artifacts that are attributed to this taxon essentially range underneath this tephra and below, and are between 50,000 and roughly 190,000 years old. Now, in a slightly more detailed look, this shows the main volcanic tephra that were really critical for working this out. And originally, like here you see T7 and T8, this tephra dates to 11,000, 12,000 years ago. And this is why initially it was thought that Homo floresiensis survived up until this time, because this is part of the tephras that are found here, and they range in and just abut up just before where Homo floresiensis was found in. But all of these tephras are much older, and actually, even though they're elevationally above these ones, they're stratigraphically below. And so essentially over the past 20 to 30,000 years, you've had this erosional surface slowly get overlain by these younger sediments. Now, what's interesting to me is, wow, if we would have had a few more years of erosion, right, all of this may well have been lost. So it's pretty spectacular that depositional processes came in just in the nick of time, essentially, to observe what we know. Now, of course, Homo floresiensis was also originally reported to have made and used sophisticated stone tools as well as even fire. However, further studies have shown that the stone tools are actually more broadly similar to the kinds of tools you find throughout the old world between about 2.5 million years ago in East Africa and even up until today in some parts of the world. And these are subsequently found everywhere in the world. And we even know that modern humans living at Liangbua in the recent past also made and used very similar kinds of tools. So there's no easy way to look at a tool and say this is a Hobbit tool versus this is a modern human tool. They're essentially hold-a-wand-like stone artifacts, the same kind that you or I would make if we're trapped out. I mean, it's easy for me to say in Canada, out in the woods. Here you don't really have the woods, but I don't know. There'd be rocks around that you would make a sharp edge to do something. But the main distinctions between these two hominin toolkits are that modern humans at Liangbua show a preference for using nodular chert that is dominated by silica, whereas Homo floresiensis artifacts are dominated by nodular chert that is iron rich. Now, there does not seem to be any difference between these two raw material types in flaking performance or anything like that. It probably, what we think it probably relates to is simply the fact that the rich form is the one that is basically present most. It's basically about 9 out of every 10 rocks you find in and around the Anguilla.
Can you open up your settings, like your computer settings? I don't know, just your computer.
Oh, is that
Can you mute?
There's a participant that is not muted. Please hit the mute button.
See, I thought it was a Hobbit speaking.
Haunting you.
And I never had my move. Too much weight.
It's just people walking around the whole.
Oh, is that what it is?
bouncing,
Okay, good.
Yeah,
And
solid stuff here.
And so what we think is that probably the way that modern humans are moving around on the landscape, they are essentially picking up some of these other materials and then transporting them to the cave. And whereas Homo floresiensis doesn't seem to be doing that. But again, this is sort of work in progress. But importantly, among all of the modern human stone artifacts at Liangbua, about 18% of these show some exposure to fire. Whereas the Homo floresiensis assemblages do not show any evidence of exposure to fire. And so it raises questions about the original claims that it was using fire. Similarly, further work that we have done, led by Mike Morley, looking at the micromorphology of the stratigraphic sequence, shows that we have no clear evidence of any hearth-like burning or intentional burning in the Homo floresiensis layers. And instead, the oldest evidence that we have is in layers between about 41,000 years old and about 24,000 years old. And this seems to be almost certainly the result of modern human site. So it appears that the evidence for burning that was previously attributed originally to Homo floresiensis was due to this misinterpretation of the stratigraphy, essentially applying the burning events that were visible in front of where LB1 was found, also like all those pieces of charcoal that were found, and gave the 18,000 to 13,000 year dates, and that this does not apply to Homo floresiensis. Now, not very cautious, and like Brian will tell me, I'm probably too cautious. I don't say that this is evidence that Homo floresiensis didn't can use fire. Maybe they did, but we at least do not have any evidence for it. And if anything, the evidence at least suggests that if they did use and make fire, they did it in a way that is archaeologically distinguishable from the way that our species was making use. Now, Homo floresiensis also survived alongside a very interesting group of animals that included, like I said, a bison-sized elephant called stegodon, giant marabou stork, vultures, dragons, and giant rats. And this was up until about 50,000 years ago or so, when all of these species, except for the rats, disappear mysteriously from the sediments preserved at the end. And so, yes, the rumors are indeed true. There are giant rats on Flores. And I put this in especially for Brian, because he always, every time I do hear from him, he's always asking me about these rats. They are the survivors. But I want to point out that there are multiple rat species of various sizes, all smaller than the giant one I just showed you, that are represented throughout the entire stratigraphy at Lakehead. I know this because waiting for us to find additional hominid remains, I had nothing to do, and so I measured 10,000 rat femoral heads, which is the data that you see here over several years. So we have all of these represented throughout the sequence, and if anything, it's the smaller rats that are there more often. But it shows our species, what I'm looking for, focus on size. Floresiensis we're excited by because it's so small. Oh, it's so cute, so small. Or in terms of the rats, the big ones. We want to just make the smaller ones invisible. They're there. And until now, there is still no direct fossil evidence that any of these rat species, endemic to Flores, grew bigger or grew smaller over time from their earlier ancestors, either on Flores or in comparison to other closely related species on the Asian continent. So even though they're often invoked as an example of the island rule, so-called island rule, we actually don't have strong evidence of that yet. Maybe it'll turn up. And until now, there is no direct fossil evidence any of the other taxa either. And this includes what I like to call the four of the big five. We're Flores, we're not East Africa. But we were to go back in time on Flores and do a tourist campaign. These four, along with Homo floresiensis, would be all the animals that you would see that are bigger than about 3 kilos. Vulture does not appear to be any bigger or smaller than its likely relatives on the continent. And both the giant marabou stork as well as the Komodo dragon deserve special mention here because you often will hear people, experts and non-experts alike, refer to them also as examples of the island rule, in this case, island giantism. It's getting larger. But the published data strongly suggest otherwise. For example, fossil evidence of Komodo dragons on Flores shows that they have not changed in size for the past 1 million years that they appear to have been on the island. And similarly, the giant marabou stork at Liangbua also now appears to be part of a large-bodied clade that is found at fossil sites in Asia and Africa, usually alongside proboscideans and hominids. Travel to East or South Africa today, see an elephant, get somewhere, and you'll see vultures and giant marabou storks. Well, no, but big ones. Those are still alive. So the best and the only evidence thus far of island dwarfing on Flores comes from proboscideans. In this case, the stegodon remains that are found alongside Homo floresiensis at Liangbua, which are thought to be the dwarf descendants of an early Pleistocene ancestor that is known from fossils in central Flores. Now, indeed, criticisms of the so-called island rule often focus on the fact that evidence of these kind of dwarfing events worldwide are almost always restricted to either elephants or deer. And when you include them in a sample of other taxa, sure, you still find a trend, but you can remove all the other taxa, or if you remove proboscideans or deer, you all of a sudden don't see this trend. Even with that, people still like the narrative. It seems to make sense. And so we have these instances of people really being attracted to this idea that animals are getting larger or smaller on islands. There may be some lineages that do this, but it's not a widespread rule that we can apply to other mammals. And specifically, we should be very careful about applying it to hominids. Now, we're very lucky that we now actually have some 700,000-year-old hominid remains from Central Flores. And this includes a mandible fragment, as well as some permanent and deciduous teeth that were discovered in 2014 and published in 2016. So do these fossils help us resolve these major questions about the ancestry of Homo floresiensis? I think it depends on who you ask. In size and shape, these fossils are essentially identical to what we see at Liangbua 650,000 years later. In other words, we actually have physical fossil evidence that suggests that no dwarfing occurred on Flores between 700,000 years ago and 60 to 100,000 years ago. That's how, if I had been part of this team, that's how you would have seen the abstract. In this case, for people who think that Homo floresiensis is an island dwarf descendant of Homo erectus, well, then it just means that it must have dwarfed earlier in time. It's possible. But then you have to explain that then they somehow reached their ideal size and just stabilized for the rest. Well, they're still possible. But for me, it's not particularly a satisfying explanation because in contrast, I think the evidence to date appears entirely consistent with the alternative, which would have Homo floresiensis tracing its ancestry with a small-brained, small-bodied species of Homo to begin with. Now, would I change my mind if the fossil evidence came forth? Yeah, I would. But there are other things that we need to think about too. Like in this case, it is interesting to think that, hey, if we found a large-bodied hominin, and let's face it, we wouldn't need very much, a big femoral head. Wow, there you've got it. We've rejected this alternative. However, we would still have to deal with another phenomenon that we should be thinking about to Homo floresiensis. What is something that we don't know at all, Homo floresiensis, that we know about their hobbits? I was going to ask a question too. Sexual dimorphism.
I was going to ask you to tell us.
Yeah, see, you're too late though. You're supposed to speak up first. Yeah. So, sexual dimorphism. We think that LB1 is female based on its small body size as well as some attributes of its pelvis. However, we don't know for sure. And all the other remains of adults so far at the Liangbua are basically just a little bit smaller than the holotype. So either we have all females or we have all males, or maybe they're monomorphic. Wouldn't that be exciting? Right? A hylobanded example. of another pattern of sexual dimorphism evolving in lineage? We don't know. And so even though we might find larger remains at some point, we should still be cautious about what that may or may not tell us until we know the pattern of sexual dimorphism. But nonetheless, I think if we were to find remains that were 700,000 years old and larger, it would certainly favor the island dwarf descendant of Homo erectus hypothesis. But there's some other things to consider that I think aren't discussed enough. And this relates to our historical understanding or ideas about what Homo erectus is in the first place. This is LB1, shown in 4 different views. Any ideas what this other medium is? Is it just me, or do these look at least reasonably familiar, reasonably similar in each of these views?
Mojocerto?
This is Mojocerto. This is the Mojocerto child. So the oldest evidence, well, if people could agree on its date, and they don't agree on its date. So it ranges between 1.8 million years ago up until maybe 1.1 or 1.2. But I think it's interesting that there are at least some phenotypic resemblances here. That the oldest Homo erectus skeleton that we have, which because it's a child, people then say, oh, that's why it doesn't look like the adults, which tend to look like a classic American football-like shape. So I sort of question whether or not this growing up would actually turn into that shape. Why would it? It's not how our crania grow. And so, maybe this idea that, people were attracted to the island dwarfed Homo erectus idea also because of the biogeographical evidence. This is what hominin we have there. And why wouldn't we have any other evidence of small-bodied or small-brained hominin that didn't look erectus-like anywhere in Asia? But maybe it's been staring us, not in the face, because the face is missing, but it's been staring at us all along, 100 years or more since this was discovered in the early 1920s. We also have Homo luzonensis now to consider. And so I think evidence is starting to grow that suggests that maybe there was greater diversity in Asia beyond just Homo erectus. Another very interesting aspect is been so focused from the beginning on the small size of the LB1 cranium that it actually deceives what we see. I don't know how it does. It's like magic. And in the original publications, it was described as having a face that is both absolutely and relatively small. It's a small looking face. It's a tiny little cranium. I should have brought a cast or something to show, but it's small. And this has been, see this idea in the literature in subsequent publications used by different people in the same way without actually examining the scaling pattern. And this is some work of one of my current graduate students. If you take the Powell's craniometric data set and you scale cranial size against facial size, you see that modern humans scale along this line. And if we then use a geometric mean of cranial size, it's the same pattern as you see here, which unfortunately this is at the top, but I don't know how to get it off. The x-axis here is greatest length of the cranium. So of all the measurements, the greatest length of the measurement is most strongly correlated with a geometric mean of overall cranial size. Now, the reason why he's done this is because there's a whole bunch of fossils that you can't get all 6 measurements of cranium, but you've got a facial measurement and you've got greatest length. So this sort of maximizes the fossil sample. Now, what you'll notice is LB1 is right here. And not that this is very sciencey, but I think if we take this slope and we move it over, well, what do we see? LB1 falls right in line with other members of early Homo, not Homo erectus. So here we have 3 different people's measurements because they, paleoanthropologists like Brian, they can't agree. Everyone wants to measure it their own way. So we're not favoring anybody. Everyone gets their measurements, their published measurements in here. Kane MER 1813 here, a number of the Demonisi specimens, even Homo rudolfensis up here. And so what we can see is that members of early Homo have slightly smaller faces than Australopiths and Paranthropines. But they're still larger compared to us, as well as Neanderthals and even African and Asian. Some of these fossils over here include Dragon Man, a recent discovery from Asia, and the Dolly cranium, which I think you don't need a PhD in paleoanthropology to realize that they do have very small faces and big crania. So here's a distinction with LB1. Put it in perspective, well, it has a face that's as large as small-bodied members of our species. So even though it's only a meter tall, it's actually in line with hominins that are much bigger from our species in terms of its face. And if we were to extrapolate down, you would have to have a cranial length that would be much, much smaller than us to scale to actually match the pattern we see in LB1. So this essentially what I was showing there before is essentially a ratio between the greatest length of the cranium and the size of the face. Now, even though this image has been staring at us since it was discovered, we still sort of focus overall on this, oh, look how small it is compared to the modern cranium. But actually, if you look how large its face is, proportionally. Now, why do I think this is important? Because of what I was showing you earlier. These limb proportions, right, seem to suggest a difference in locomotor repertoire. We have small faces, as do Neanderthals and Asian and African Homo erectus, because we have limb proportions like this, and we're adapted for running. The decreased size in our face is not only due to potentially dietary or masticatory changes, but it changes how we're able to run. So larger faces actually destabilize the head during running. So if you look at the arguments begun by Bramble and Lieberman in the early 2000s about the evolution of endurance running in hominins, this is actually one of the predictions about seeing changes to the face in hominins that are adapted to running. To me, I think this shows an interesting difference between early Homo, right, or whatever we want to call those hominins, that there's been some changes to their face relative to their Australopith ancestors or their likely Australopith ancestors that are most certainly related to changes in diet. But subsequent changes both to the cranium and the postcrania then occur when you get these hominins further specialized and get more. So I think it's really interesting that generally the postcranial evidence, which from the neck down to the tips of the toes, really suggests a lot of changes that we actually see changes in the or morphology in the head that's also preserved that goes along into sort of a whole body idea about how evolution in the genus Homo took place. And I think, I could be wrong, but if LB1 would have been found in Africa, sediments between 2 and 3 million years ago, I would bet we would already be talking about these things. People would see it, but because it's way out in the outskirts of Asia and strangest possible time, it's been challenging for this to become. So again, modern humans, we are well adapted to both walking and running. Homo floresiensis was adapted to walking and climbing, but not running. And I think, and maybe I push this a little too far, but I think this is probably a really great example for us in terms of what we should be expecting the early Homo morphology to be. And so I suspect, right, and I'll bet Brian, a few beers, that if he ever finds further evidence of the individual or the population that's represented by the Lady Guerrero mandible, he may begin to see features that resemble what we see in Homo floresiensis. So again, is Homo floresiensis an island dwarf descendant of Asian Homo erectus, or is it a descendant of some unknown hominin lineage? But again, early Homo in Asia with small brains and small body. I mean, I leave it up to you. We don't really know the answer yet. My thinking would certainly be influenced by further fossil evidence going one way or another. But if, like I said earlier, if I had to bet my money, and I'm in Vegas, right? So it's the place to be to bet. I would bet on number 2. Now to sum up again, Homo floresiensis is known only from Flores, this oceanic island that's wedged between the southeastern continental shelf of Asia, one side, and Australia on the other. And at times of low sea levels in the past, Flores has never been connected by land to either of these continents. Their ancestors appear to have arrived on the island at least 1 million years ago, based on stone tools found in central Flores. And they are last seen about 50,000 years ago here at the Angbua, which is this magnificent limestone cave that preserves a relatively continuous stratigraphic sequence for the past 200,000 years. Exactly how closely related we are to these hobbits remains an open question. 4 of these species here are obviously more closely related to each other than any of them are to chimpanzees or bonobos. But hobbits undoubtedly preserve ancient parts of the human genome, long since disappeared entirely in those of us living today. In that respect, if their DNA is ever successfully obtained and sequenced, it will provide a critical window into the genetic diversity that was present in the human family tree prior to 1 million years ago, helping us to better understand the complex evolutionary processes that ultimately led to the extinction of all of these different human species, all except one. So on behalf of my research team and field crew in Indonesia, as well as many colleagues and collaborators in Indonesia, elsewhere in the world, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to try and answer any questions that you might have.
Chat over in case anybody's got any questions.
All right, yeah.
Well, I actually stayed on time.
Not bad. Do I maximize it or?
Stop sharing. Yeah, stop sharing and then you'll be able to see the little chat. There
Okay.
you go. A chat icon in the bottom corner.
You started getting
There you go.
All right,
fast.
Yeah,
Yes.
probably.
an hour.
I had visions that I spoke for an extra hour.
Yeah,
I am a.
seemed like it.
So there is one question in the chat thread. Were there any potential predators in Flores of these hominins?
Yes, absolutely. Well, the Komodo dragons would have been their biggest threat. So again, like I said earlier, just reading this one.
You can't get back here.
Unless you share again. You want to share it, you go up to the top and do share my screen and then
Just at the bottom, share
up to the top of the screen and it
in
should
the
come
PowerPoint.
down.
can click share.
Brian, you want to help him?
Yes. But if I could, I know.
Or
Don't look at me.
share at the bottom, and it'll bring up the PowerPoint. Here you go.
Where's the box to share?
Go into WebEx.
Share
Share at the bottom.
That's the one I wanted.
Click your Microsoft PowerPoint.
Your PowerPoint.
Share.
There we go.
Share.
Now share, there we go. All right.
How many
Got it.
buttons?
So the question was
Doing in
potential
classrooms
predators.
in terms of
So,
the answers.
like I said, there is, these are the animals that, as well as Homo floresiensis, all of these are the only animals bigger than 3 kilos. So the only real predator would have been the Komodo dragon, as well as these potential scavenging birds. But given that they're mostly scavengers, I think that they wouldn't have been a predatory threat to Homo floresiensis, but Komodo dragons for sure. But other than that, probably snakes. There's a large number of snakes on Flores, but that would be it. So no mammalian predators, which
Do you think Komodo dragons could have been a selective force
potentially, I mean, they are,
or boreality, say?
well, you see, even Komodo dragons can climb. But juvenile Komodo dragons actually spend a large part of their time climbing, in part to get away from the larger adult Komodo dragons. So, yeah, this is where it's kind of an interesting issue, because nowhere else do we have hominins in a place where they don't have mammalian carnivores to deal with. And so, I don't know, I tend to look at this, I didn't talk about this, but I have another student who recently finished her PhD, and she's been focusing on the taphonomic aspects of the assemblage. And she did her dissertation working on the rat remains, and is now shifting into the stegodon remains for her postdoc. We don't really have any evidence that shows that Homo floresiensis had primary access to the stegodon remains we see at Liangbua. So it does suggest that all of these taxa that you see here form an interconnected group of these large animals, where you have the stegodon is the only large herbivore, and you have these three, as well as Homo floresiensis, acting as a scavenging guild surrounding this large herbivore. So probably once in a while, Komodo dragons don't necessarily have to hunt. They smell really well. They just wait for things to die, right? If they do hunt, they basically just bite and then wait and ambush, or, wait for the animal to succumb to the poison and other bacteria in their saliva that gets into them. And then there was probably just these scavenging dinners that occurred that Homo floresiensis probably also took part in. And so in that regard, I think that's probably why, they may not have influenced each other that much in terms of their size. And as I mentioned, Komodo dragons are the same size on Flores 1 million years ago all the way up till today. So will remain to see, be answered by further fossil discoveries on Flores, hopefully in between this large span of time. Yeah.
How different was the paleoecology, especially in relation to the sea level? Because I imagine over 50,000 years or so on that very topographically, different island landscape, that would be pretty different.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think the short answer is we don't really know. What's interesting is that from the rat remains, like here, I was showing you how we have all of these different rats represented in the sequence, but the proportions of these rats do change through time at Liangbua. And particularly the medium rats are mostly represented by a species called Komodomes, which is now only found on the islands of Komodo and Rincha. And it is the one rat of these that really prefers more open grassland type habitats. And it is the rat that is most common, dominates the Homo floresiensis deposits. And I think this is a signal that stegodon as well, isotopically it's a grazer, would have preferred these open habitats. So I think Liang Bua, in part, what is driving all of these remains that we find in the Hobbit deposits is that at that time, it was more open around the cave. But that doesn't mean there's a complete absence of more forest adapted species, including these other rats. But I think the proportions of these different habitats would have varied. Now, Flores overall, it's a fairly large island, and it varies a lot topographically, like in altitude. It's basically was formed by underwater volcanoes that are still active. It's the Ring of Fire. And so you basically have this southern part of the island is rising up, and then everything else is pretty undulating. And, you know, just to give you an example, to go from Liang Bua to Central Flores, these other sites that have the older remains, it's only 50 kilometers. So you look at a map and you draw a line, you're like, oh, that's no problem. But if you try to drive there, it'll take you 5 to 6 hours. Essentially going like this, up one hill, down and up again, you know, so it's very complicated. And that as well, I think, would have always led to a variety of habitats and essentially paleoecology. So I think in general, back in time, it's not like it may have, you know, we would have big changes in climate through some of these times, but overall, there would have always still been some habitats for all of these animals, just in different proportions. So we need a lot more work to be done sort of locally on Flores to maybe fill that shroud. This is a big thing. Like, I think, do we know when Homo floresiensis went extinct? Well, not really. We just know it disappears from Liang Bua about 50,000 years ago, but the rats change, right? So maybe they're tracking stegodon, or they're just moving wherever the stegodon. So we need more sites. Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that other hominid that you compared to the
Homo floresiensis, or
no, there was one, I don't know if Asia.
Mojokerto? Yeah. So Mojokerto was essentially one of the first specimens of Homo erectus. Like, after Homo erectus was created by Dubois based off of fossil remains from Trinil, which is in East Java in Indonesia. This was discovered in the early 20s by von Koenigswald, one of Brian's heroes, I believe, right? And it was found in Mojokerto, which, funnily enough, is not far from where my wife is Indonesian, and she's from about an hour from Mojokerto. And so Mojokerto is actually just a city. And so this cranium was found, I think, in the early to mid 1920s. And it was assessed to be a child, and it became known as the Mojokerto child skeleton. And because of Trinil's discovery, it was attributed to Homo erectus, and ever since it's just been thought of as a child Homo erectus specimen. It's been dated various times. The difficulty is people don't know exactly where it was found, and so if people debate whether it was here or not, they've gone back and tried to isolate it. Yeah, no problem. And so that's why the ages range, but generally people feel that it's the oldest representative of Homo erectus in Indonesia. And so whenever you see any statement that says, oh, Homo erectus was in Southeast Asia 1.8 million years ago, what they're actually referring to is Mojokerto. And so, you know, I don't want to this is not an analysis, right? This is just me putting up, this is because one day I was sitting in my lab at Lakehead University when I'd just gone there, and I had got all the casts I had inherited from the previous biological anthropologist, and I had them laid out on tables. I hadn't set up my lab, and I was just working away on some stuff on my computer, and I happened to glance over at the table, and I saw it, and I thought, how the hell did they end up getting a cast of LB1? Like, they're not really out there, right? But I was literally flummoxed in my head because I'm looking at the side view, kind of like a view like this, but turned maybe like that. And I'm like, that looks just like LB1. And I went over there and I couldn't believe that it was an old, like plaster, like one of those really old, heavy but fragile casts of the Mojokerto child. And this happens to be a CT scan of a cast that I had, and it's striking the resemblance. Now, it is bigger, like here on this view, you can see it actually is slightly taller, and it is a child. But again, even for modern humans, we reach our adult brain sizes by the time we're 6, 7 years old, right? Like it happens pretty quick, and we don't know for sure how quickly this may have occurred. There's estimates if it is Homo erectus, like an estimate of how fast it's occurring. But what if it's close to reaching its full size, or what if it's a male, or maybe they were bigger and there was some dwarfing, but maybe this is not. Maybe we actually have had evidence of something else there all along. I'm just using it as an example to underscore how much we don't know and why we shouldn't necessarily be blindly accepting narratives just because they sound good. We should be constantly trying to put our own feet to the fire about what the evidence actually says.
I guess a comment and a question. So the comment I would say is I appreciate talk in that you're open to reinterpretation and you're acknowledging the kind of the gaps. I, as an archaeologist, whenever I lecture in archaeology, I always say, this is what we know now.
Yeah, exactly.
But when new data or new information comes, be prepared for a new story. Sometimes I think people really dig in and they do not want a new story because they've invested so much in the old story. So I can appreciate that. And it's also very interesting how much of this just comes down to basic formation processes, which is interesting. My question, I don't know if you spoke to this, and maybe you did and I missed it. The correlation or the relationships between various features. You can see the big face associated with the locomotion, the small facial features more with the running and is this just some kind of evolutionary patchwork thing, or is it a visual, like it changes the kind of vision, or is there an explanation for that?
It's biomechanics. So
Okay.
when you're running, what happens is, my understanding is once your foot strikes the ground, the head pitches. So the larger the face, the more the pitch. So people that have like Lieberman that is, they say that there's a change by changing that size of the face, and also maybe, adding either that and or adding additional, almost like the Neanderthal occipital bun kind of thing. Yeah, exactly, to offset that so that the eyes can remain forward and not the head becoming destabilized. So when they do running experiments, right? And so this is what like Dan Lieberman's a lot of research is. He puts graduate students on treadmills, right? And that's what they do. They actually will weight the front of the head to show how energetically inefficient it is to, replicate what it would be like to have that larger face.
And have they also climbed with the larger face? To see,
I don't know if they've done
would be
that,
an
but yeah.
experiment maybe you could have your graduate students do?
Which can you do?
Put all this weight on your face, now climb that tree.
But you guys look at like football helmets, like, the different face masks of
Right.
football helmets, yeah, it makes a big difference. Like when I played in high school and like you were always trying to get the lightest possible.
Yeah. So, I like, what I find interesting about this is that, when I learned about human evolution, or even when I was at the Smithsonian and I would listen to Rick Potts, who's the main paleoanthropologist there, explain, the evolution of skull shape through time, all of us are well aware of this phenomenon, that early Homo have smaller faces than Australopiths, but still larger relative faces than later hominids, like Homo erectus. And so, Bramble and Lieberman in 2004, this idea that, okay, we're not good sprinters, but we're good endurance runners. There seem to be even convergences in our neck muscles with other mammals that are also runners. So there's been these changes that we fall into this trap that it's all about diet, right?
Yeah.
That it's their teeth. And there's no question that diet has played a role in some way, but it may be a combination of both diet and locomotion, which I think then makes it interesting and it gives us an explanation for why we might have had adaptive diversity within our genus. And so I think it's beyond just sort of this evolutionary idea. There's some biomechanics behind it, whether or not that's ultimately the right answer or not, you know, who knows. But to me, I think pins are starting to line up in that direction.
I mean, because when I think about like facial features, I also think about like the size of the eyes and visual and sinuses and breathing and all this other stuff too, not just the weight of
Sure.
these features hanging off your face, but.
Well, noses, yeah,
Yeah.
like even all of that. And, you know, the nasal bones of LB1 are not preserved well enough to get an idea of what type of external nose it may or may not have had. And that's something else that we just don't know about. But generally in Homo erectus, regardless of whether you split them into ergaster or Asian forms, you know, they seem to have noses more like us. So it does seem like.
Like the hotter the climate, the bigger the nostrils, you know, so to
Yeah.
purge the hot air out of you
Right.
for ostensibly for long distances.
Like, and at Areocotomy, right, we have this is the oldest fossil evidence of our modern human-like body proportions, right? 1.6 million years ago. Body proportions of earlier hominins, even like OH62, for instance. Okay, it's battered up, but it's estimated to be much more Australopith-like. And so there's been this undercurrent for a long time of, you know, pre-erectus hominins. I hate using pre because I see them as contemporaneous and after, but you understand what I mean? Like a hominin that does not have all of the derived characteristics that we associate with erectus, they still have body proportions and skull and facial morphology that shows this mixture between walking and climbing and not running. Whereas in their case, their facial differences with Australopiths is likely dietary. Right? But subsequent to that, we seem to have another shift, which is our ancestry, descendants of that particular range. We'll come back. Go ahead.
Ask a non-archaeological question, but I'm curious about the community interest in your guys' project. Do you have a lot of community interest, or are you guys kind of the fossil guys that are in the cave?
Oh, no. Yeah, no, absolutely. Like the work at Liangbua is actually dominated by locals. So almost, I would say, well, 9 out of every 10 people here are local people that live in and around the cave. And so we generally employ up to 45 to 50 people during our excavations there. And yeah, for them, like their village is called Liangbua. We think of it as foreigners as just the cave, but there's several sort of hamlets that all live within that, within the, almost I would say even 5 to 8 kilometers around the cave. Yeah, they're very much interested in it because it brings, like there are tourists that come here every day, like throughout the year, there are tourists from all over the world. We've built a small museum just about 100 meters in front of the cave that has a 3D printed replica of the main skeleton as well as various 20 museum style panels. And so, yeah, both at the local level and even the regional level, it's seen as a very big tourist boost for. Generally before, as an example, people would visit Flores, but they would just stay on the West Coast and go see the Komodo dragons. Whereas now many more sort of do an island trek across the island and stop at places like Liangbua.
I think we have this room for 5 minutes left. If anybody else has a final question? No, okay.
I don't believe it. I don't believe it.
Yeah, help you sign off that stuff.
Elsie was here?
Told them about it. Yeah.
Do you want to go on?